Hey, my name is Ramirez, and I'm Frogbear. I'm Frogbear. You can call me Rami. Today, the title might be called "Going Nuclear," but it has very little to do with what current ideas we have of nuclear. It has more to do with the fact of human behavioral science and the fact that there is a clear lack of it on a certain side of the aisle. And I'm merely highlighting a very specific portion of events. Um, I wanted to go much more into depth with it, but the time period was way too long. Aspects of it were far longer than I could have thought. But just know that these experiments went on all the way up until the early 80s, and they got the worst during the Cold War because how do I say this? There was essentially the advent of for the greater good of all is what allowed for a lot of this to occur in human history. But before I get into what I really want to get into, which is called the Plutonium Files, it's a really great book. That's not what we're getting into actually. So first I'm gonna start off with, I'll show you the Discord, right? So this started off with me looking for this video that you see here. Some people really are born to be bad. And the book is called Evil Genes, right? This is a discussion that happened in 2008 with a woman.
Little manifestations of disorder, but they're never really technically diagnosed.
Okay, it's way too far ahead. I was making sure that I got the right times. Essentially, in her book, all she's highlighting, what inspired her, actually I should just start off with that. What inspired her to actually write this book at the beginning of her career was essentially her sister. She starts off with a really interesting story about how her sister did something very cold-blooded, which is where we get into the discussion of what we call reptilians. In reality, it's just people who make decisions purely based on their desire factors, or people who make decisions that seem very cold-hearted to us. Let's see if I could.
One was named Art Brown.
Okay, yeah, she starts off with the story.
Why Rome fell, Hitler rose, Enron failed, and my sister stole my mother's boyfriend. And she really did steal my mother's boyfriend. So what's the story behind that? My mother had always wanted to go to Paris. And late in life, she met a man who wanted to make her dream come true. So she was really ecstatic. They were both rather elderly by that time. He was about 80. He was on oxygen tanks for his emphysema, but they planned to take those with them on the plane and go.
Right, so this dude's not desirable at all. Doesn't have much going on for him. Super old. Has to carry around oxygen tanks. So he's not very desirable by any stretch of the imagination.
To Paris. So my mother at that time was living in Washington State, and my sister was living in Southern California. So my sister calls my mother one day and says, you know, Mom, how's things going? And my mom got all excited. I'm going to Paris, right? So
he tells her the story, and you'd imagine that the daughter would be incredibly happy for her daughter, that she would be ecstatic for what her mom's about to experience, right? Well, let's see what happens.
My sister immediately hangs up the phone, packs everything all up. Within a week, she'd moved up to Washington State to an apartment right next to my mother's, and coincidentally, right next to the man who was taking her to Paris.
What do you think is going to happen? What do you think her sister was planning from the very beginning? Now, why? Why would somebody do that to their own mother? Especially after hearing her on the phone and how excited she was to go to somewhere she's wanted to go her entire life. Why would somebody as young as her rob her elderly mother of that experience? The why factor is very important here. Let's keep going.
Well, She turned on a little of the charm, doesn't take much, even though he's 40 years older than her. And next thing you know, she was on that plane to Paris. And then, as soon as she got back, of course, she dropped the guy like a hot rock. We all wonder, why do people do things like this? We've all encountered.
Why? Why would you make such a cold-hearted decision over such a very small window of fun or an experience? Especially when it's your own mom. Somebody, or at least, we all say that thing of somebody who gave birth to you. How could you do something like that?
Encountered someone sooner or later where you say, what could they be thinking? How could they be so self-centered and so willing to hurt other people by doing something that they just feel like doing? It turns out, although we're often familiar with this kind of thing on a family level, it also happens on much broader scales.
Okay, yeah, she's gonna bring up the story of this leader who meets up with his wife, and she gives an explanation. There's an atrocity that happens that he's at the center of, and when he's asked a question that relates to, right, essentially the reporter cornered him into a line of questioning that he had to admit that things didn't have to escalate that far. But instead of admitting to it, or instead of kind of dancing around the subject, instead what he says is, I can't hear you. My listening device has gone off. All right, just an excuse. But what I really wanted to highlight was around 9 minutes.
Especially in the nasty things that they would do to other people. I decided, wait a minute, now I do bioengineering research, got my PhD in a solid, scientifically grounded subject. I know how to do research. Why don't I use some of those skills and go see what the literature tells us? So I went in. There's a science database called Medline, and it is...
Right. She basically describes that there's this database that you can search up in it. You can type in terms, and it'll come back to you with cited research or any attempted studies. A giant database where doctors like her just dump information on.
To look up what kind of studies have been done on people. So I decided to go to Medline and see what Medline said about nasty people. Well, first thing, when you're looking on something like this, Medline, what kind of search words do you use to look up nasty people? I mean, you can't type in nasty and see if somebody's done some kind of...
Right, so what are the terms? What are the criteria? Of course, she's not in psychology, so she wouldn't know any of the terms that would be associated with these behavioral patterns that she's speaking on. So she just has a little quip about how, what do you do? What do we type in? How do we look at this?
Imaging study on nastiness or something like that. So I poked around and I looked around, and then the best thing I could seem to find as far as a term that people used for people like Slobodan Milosevic was the term malignant narcissism.
Right? So she types that in on Google, and just thousands and thousands of articles that are written about narcissism, malignant narcissism, and all sorts of nasty things, right? That relate to the word narcissism. But when she gets down to it,
for that phenomenon, I'll go take a look and see what the science literature says about it. So first I Googled up, or I didn't Google up, but I went to Medline and I Medlined up antisocial personality disorder. There's like 5,000 or more studies, at least at that time. And talking good, solid scientific studies, genetics, medical imaging, and so forth.
Right? Seems reasonable that there are these things, right? If it's a demonstrable thing, I could clearly see it. Type it in, see a bunch of results. Now, here's the key. When she types in...
Good studies. Looked at borderline personality disorder, that's another disorder. And there were about 3,000 studies. So then I Medlined up malignant narcissism. Do you know how many studies I found? Zero. Zero scientific studies on the term malignant narcissism.
Zero. Absolutely none. How, right? Like, at that point, at least me personally, I would question, all right, if these studies aren't under this term, are there any other terms? But what she ends up discovering is that there isn't. But there's a reason for why there isn't any studies or research relevant to this specific portion of behavioral patterns. And it's crazy what she says.
So here's a term that everybody's using all the time as if it actually meant something, and maybe it does mean something, but there's no scientific research upon which that term is actually based. So I thought, I think this is a little bit of a problem. So then I realized something else that was quite interesting. Psychology has done incredible research over the last 100 years. But what they've done is they've done research to categorize people who are really, really ill, right? They're clinically ill. What does it mean to be clinically ill?
She's essentially describing two sides of the extreme, where psychology has only ever been able to identify or been able to observe the most extreme cases of behavioral patterns that seem out of the norm, right? So that's pretty normal, right? We could look at people, demonstrably see that there's a different, they exhibit different behavioral patterns. So somebody could look at that and be like, this isn't right. What's causing these variations in people?
It means you are so sick, either mentally or physically, that you have somehow been brought in to a clinic or brought yourself into a clinic, and you've been diagnosed as being ill with some disorder. But here's the trick. A lot of personality disorders, the very heart of the disorder is you cannot tell there's anything wrong with you. So you're not going to go into a clinic and say, hey, look, you know, I'm really sick. I'm a sadist, right? Treat me, right? It just doesn't happen.
Because they don't know. They think it's just a part of their average life. They think that it's normal for them to behave this way, which is why a lot of people nowadays like watching Kevin Samuels. Because Kevin Samuels is the only one. I don't know if he's the only one, but I've heard him plenty of times look at certain people, speak to certain women, and be like, are you going to therapy? Because you really need to go to therapy, right? It was, at least he had the wherewithal to recognize that the way that these women were behaving, acting, speaking, or maintaining themselves was not very conducive to a healthy lifestyle. So he would have to tell them, you really need to go to a therapist. Now, the problem is, there's a bunch of memes now that show women who get ghosted by their own therapist. How far can these extreme cases go? I'm just using that red pill community as an example.
So a lot of the research has only been done on really, really ill people, right? Who are very easy to detect in that either.
Right? Our science is only really equipped to view the most extreme cases of these scenarios. And it's not really it doesn't really equip people to understand, how do I say, a broader subject, right? And understanding that it's not just the extreme cases that need to be looked at, because there are, in cases like, oh wait, did she say it?
They get dragged in there because of the court systems, dragged into a clinic, or
dragged into it because of a court system. That's why I wanted to say Amber Heard. She had to actually be dragged into a court case in order for her to actually sit down with somebody like a therapist, a psychologist, in this case it was an analyst, in order to determine what her problems were and where they stemmed from. If that never occurs, right? If that portion never occurs, that means the person or people will never know that there are a variety of different psychological issues that can arise from, you know what I mean?
Or they are at least well enough to recognize there is something wrong with themselves. And what that leaves is a whole class of people who are subclinically ill, right? Or they have subclinical little manifestations of disorder, but they're never really technically diagnosed with anyone as having any problem.
Because most people will just assume that's just the way they are. That's just the way that they've behaved their entire life, without recognizing that maybe it isn't supposed to be a part of their programming. Maybe it was a learned behavior. Maybe these were things that occurred in these people's lives that manifested these quirks inside of their personality. Now, okay, so now I'm gonna stop this video because this isn't the video that I actually wanted to show you. I was just merely demonstrating from an author's perspective, right? It's on C-SPAN Book TV. Clearly a scientist, clearly a doctor. This was an interview from 2008, as it says in the parentheses down below, to show that not everything is as it seems, right? We can now identify that there is a problem, right? Now, I'm going to move on to the actual video that I wanted, which was the plutonium vials. Now, I might skip between two different videos because C-SPAN, the website, uses what do you call the JavaScript? It's like a very old media player that most modern web players don't actually use anymore. So just keep in mind that the C-SPAN website might have problems with playing the video, so it might just like pause on me or something. That's what I was gonna say. So I gotta go through this quick. All right, her name is Eileen Wellsome.
Programs you've seen this weekend or any.
Citizens included pregnant, which
And the footnote is what led to this book.
Okay, she's essentially describing at the beginning of her dissertation, she was working at a newspaper publication, and at the area that she was at, the news, her editor, whoever gave her the assignment, was like, hey, this military base is doing something. We need you to investigate what's going on. She looked into it, and then she discovered that they were discarding radioactive waste or radioactive pits. And these radioactive pits included animal experiments. But she started paying attention to the little footnotes on the side of the report. And through looking through the footnotes is when she discovered that there were 18 human experiments. Right, there were 18 human experiments that all related to isotope radiation, isotope infection, and this was all occurring pre-World War II and post World War II, very much into the Cold War as well. So, moving forward.
One footnote led to this book. So he gathered together a stack of these reports.
Right, she basically gives the story about how she contacted the military officer and she began her investigation. Now, what was incredibly shocking to me, what she discovered, was the people who handled this experiment, the people who actually went along with this whole thing, or at least the people who were overseeing the project, was the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project had two different sides of it. It had a physicist side of it, of the people who were actively trying to develop the atomic bomb, but there was also the other side of it, which was doctors, physicians, and medical institutions, all the way from universities to private clinicians, who were actively working on the behalf of military in order to conduct a lot of these human experiments. So you will hear some pretty gruesome shit. Now I'm going to go open the YouTube video. Same lady. She's just being interviewed, I think, in a radio station in this one, because it's only in this interview that she says what I'm looking for. And by the way, I should mention, show you the Discord pop out. I don't know if I will include all these notes, but I took notes from the first video. I wrote down the minutes of what I found the most interesting during this time. I will heavily use these notes for the C-SPAN video, not necessarily for this YouTube video. But the first one that I want to get to is, this was 1945, describes a meeting in Los Alamos on the effects of radiation where, right, a bunch of, all of the scientists that were involved in the Manhattan Project got together and were talking about what are the effects of radiation on the human being. And they really wanted to know what they were. Well, around that area in Los Alamos, somebody got into a recent car crash. I wrote Ed Cab because the closed captions in the video are also kind of off. But he was the first one used. This was at 13 minutes in. The people who handled these experiments were all the same people of the Manhattan Project, right? So, right, dude gets into a car crash. The very next day, he finds himself being injected with radioactive isotopes. And the reason why I brought up evil genes was because the people, there's a clear like she brings it up, there was a clear demonstrable effect that the Manhattan Project was very sensitive to the consent of the people that they were experimenting on, right? I'm merely bringing up the fact that, right, why did I bring up evil genes? Is, how do I say this? I don't necessarily believe that these experiments were done in good faith. I don't believe that the people who, a very difficult subject. You know, there's this whole thing of what is the importance of spirituality in a human being's life? And I've come to the conclusion one of the most important things that comes from spirituality is morality, the understanding of what is right and wrong. Of course, you can learn that in philosophy, but it's very shaky because it isn't built on a foundation of, I guess, respecting another human life. Because essentially, science with atheism, or at least with no respect to life, you will do some pretty egregious shit. You will push through and through experiments, and whoever decided to push forward through these experiments, fully knowing what they were doing after, because you have to remember, these experiments continued. And by continued, they continued so far that they kept tabs on all of these, I wanted to say experiments, but these are human people. Like, they kept tabs on them. And when people caught on to what was going on in their lives, they were labeled crazy. They were pushed to the fringe. And in some cases, they were locked up into certain psychological wards. But in reality, they were actually being experimented on. So the whole notion comes in, who would do such a thing? And under what pretense would you go so far, even after the war was already over? Why would you go that far into belittling someone's life? To me, it's shocking, but either way, I do want to play this. She said,
with you, but now that we're yellow sheets of paper, and then as I gathered,
right, she's describing how, yeah, she, from the 18 patients that she discovered, because this story gets even bigger, from the 18 people that she discovered in this experiment, she was able to identify 17 of them. There was only one individual that she wasn't able to identify, and that individual was from Chicago.
was injected with plutonium. And so given given those few clues, and that this person might have lived in Italy, Texas, I was determined to go there and knock on every door till I found this man.
We're talking to Pulitzer Prize.
And the way that she discovered it was the man basically had an amputated limb, and that's how she found Elmer.
So I said, of course, and I wrote the number down, and within minutes I was talking to Mrs. Allen.
And what did you say?
Did agree on the phone as I reeled out Elmer's story.
What was
right? She didn't want to like scare them by bringing up all this information and then kind of like putting the family in an awkward situation. But she explained it, and they actually invited her over.
Out there to start a better life. They had 2 young babies, and that was the beginning of his participation in this experiment. And his leg did not heal, and he kept going back to the doctor, and somehow he found himself in this clinic at UC San Francisco, University of California Hospital in San Francisco.
You're going to also find out that this experiment was not localized to any one location. This was across America. Again, what pushes somebody to go so far with these experiments? Fully knowing the article that I showed prior hand to how you can obfuscate responsibility, right? When there is an authority figure telling you it's okay, you can continue this research. They knew that this was unsafe from the very beginning, but they continued the research because they wanted to see where were the long-standing effects. If you don't believe me, just wait, because the Vanderbilt University has a paper trail much longer than you like to think.
And
Oh, they were one of the major
for
universities that
this,
participated in this.
Radiation known that he had an osteogenic sarcoma in order to save him. There's some question about whether he did or didn't have that cancer, and I do not know the answer to that. But
did it in the middle of that?
they eventually, with the consent of Mrs. Allen, I was able to get Elmer's medical records from UC San Francisco, and in those medical records, the doctors talked about putting that target on his calf prior to the injection.
Now, he never knew he was a subject in a U.S. government experiment, but he suspected something. Is that right?
Yes, he's told a good friend of his in Italy, Texas, that the doctors kept flying in and out of his room, practicing to be doctors. And
Right? He's in the hospital. He's in this clinic, and he's just like, why are there so many doctors coming in and out? Why are there so many doctors from out of the state coming in and out? Why are they bringing all of these other doctors who aren't even doctors? They're studying to be doctors. Why are they visiting me? It's a clear demonstrable effect of something's going on. There is no need for me to get all of these visits from all of these doctors. There is no need for me to get a visit from students. You know what I mean? Either way, oops, wrong button.
he told his friend, they guinea pig me. You know.
We interviewed Elmerine Allen a number of times, and she talked about how growing up her father would say that. And then when she was leaving for college, he said, watch out, don't let the U.S. government guinea pig you. And they always thought, well, Elmer had some kind of, you know, he was sort of quirky, and he had this delusion that the government had experimented on him.
The sad part about and the tragic part about Elmer's story is that nobody believed him. He went to his doctor and told him, you know, I think I've been injected with something. His doctor diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic at the same time that he was conversing with the atomic energy scientists in Argonne National Lab to
The doctor was communicating with the other doctors that were conducting this experiment. And the other doctors told his physician or his doctor, label him a schizophrenic, label him a paranoid. All because of what? Why? Why not just, you know what I mean? Like the gig is up. The jig is up. It is clearly now known that he knows that something's wrong. I just realized that I'm already 30 minutes into this video. I'm going to leave these videos here because realistically, this is long. I'm merely just going to read what I found, just me watching these videos, because I don't want this video to be too long. So, all the Manhattan Project 1743 who ran this program, Manhattan Project, yet they don't mention the doctors who were interested, right? She mentions herself. These are words that come out of her mouth, that the doctors who were invested into all this were interested in protecting their workers inside of the weapons complex. That means that the scientists went out of their way to defend, to scratch out, to make all records disappeared of all people involved in this, especially if you were working in the military industrial complex, since they were interested in knowing what the new radioisotopes at the time would do to the human body. At 1830, records indicate that J. Robert Oppenheimer personally signed off on these human experiments, and this is detailed in memos that she found, that it was clearly obvious who was allowing and signing off on a lot of these things. These studies ranged from the Bay Area, Texas, through military, New York, Oregon, Massachusetts, Tennessee. It gets worse. At 22 minutes 20 seconds, a random 18-year-old in New York describing her condition. At 22 minutes 38 seconds, the Tennessee pregnant woman, she gives a story about a specific woman who was fed a radioactive cocktail and she was told that it was just vitamins that would help her with her baby. The purpose of the study was to see how regularly iodine passed through the placenta. That was the whole purpose of them studying on all these pregnant women. And it wasn't just one. It was over 800 women in Tennessee who were fed radioactive vitamin cocktails. Or at least that's what they were told, because they wanted to see what the effect of iodine was through the placenta. At 23 minutes, 56 seconds, patients in Ohio were brought into the hospital basement to get experimented on. This was a hybrid experiment between the medical industry and military, but this was at night. These patients were dead asleep at night and were taken into the basement to be secretly experimented on. At 25 minutes, she describes that Clinton was the one who set up an investigation board on this radiation testing program. And this was under the Department of Energy. It's called the Atomic Energy Commission. That was the first one that happened. Then there was the Clinton investigation. The report itself was released the same day that the OJ trial verdict was given. At 26 minutes 15, what were the results? They deliberately picked those who had no voice or any means of defending themselves, right? People who did not know politicians, people who they actively knew that if they tried going out and explaining to people what was going on, they wouldn't believe them. It gets worse. At 27:31, prisoners in Oregon had their junks radiated because NASA wanted to see the effects of what the space atmosphere would do to their astronauts. At 29 minutes 22 seconds, as she was writing her book, the government was covering its trail, and she knew that after her writing her book, it would be much more difficult for her to get this information out. Right? She even says, my intuition told me. At 29:39, soldiers were asked to go into blast zones. Right? So when they were actively testing these bombs, they deliberately told the soldiers, fully knowing what would happen to some of these soldiers, fully knowing, they told them to go retrieve certain instruments or certain things inside of these blast zones, fully knowing what they were going to do, fully knowing that something was going to happen to these soldiers. And it gets much worse. Chemtrails, spraying radiation over cities, schools. The most famous one that she describes is called the Green Run, 3226. At 31:28, I don't know if that makes sense. 32:28, maybe, I don't know. Biggest revelation for the author. And during the interview, the science institutions defend these experiments. Even to this day, if you call any of these institutions, they will defend the validity of these experiments. Now back to the C-SPAN notes. I started at 25 minutes because that's where I originally left off. I wasn't writing notes at the beginning, but I kept getting more and more angry at this. 34 minutes, okay. At 25:19, the war allowed for it. They gave the same rhetoric. For the good of the many, for the good of all, for the good of the nation, for the good of national security. You can just imagine what excuses they were giving all of these scientists. And by the way, she mentions it herself. The Manhattan Project knew the dosage that would be detrimental to someone's health. Yet, in some cases, they were giving up patients up to 5 times the amount. And it gets worse. 25:19, the war allowed for it. 26 minutes, or 26-ish minutes. An old lady who was cared for many years, a long record, right, describing one of the patients that she discovered lived to a very long age, and she was taken care of by her family. And when she asked for her medical records, none of it mentioned any of the experiments, and none of it mentioned how the Department of Energy still kept track of these patients. 28:43, the Department of Energy was the one who headed these experiments. 29 minutes, admission, newspapers around the countries went off like wildfire. People started calling in, describing that at some point in Tennessee that the story broke out with the pregnant woman, and it broke out through the entire nation, essentially causing a bit of mass hysteria, and a lot of people started realizing that they were involved in these experiments, and the Clinton investigation proves that. And I think the most reparations that they paid out to some of these families were up to $400,000, and that was the most amount of money that they received, or at least that was given during that ordeal. At 30 minutes, okay, I didn't mention this one. In this video, the YouTube video, at 21 minutes, where did I even write that? 21 minutes. Massachusetts school. Kids were fed radioactive oatmeal, and the way that they would administer this was through the milk. This was a school for the mentally disabled. And they would give them cheap gifts like Mickey Mouse watches, tickets to certain games, or they would take them out to certain events. And it was under the guise of, "You want to join the science club, kid?" 33:13. The pregnant woman's side effects and the doctor's response. Essentially, her anecdote of, because she reads the passage from the book, so it essentially describes with much more detail what the doctor said to her, but she also goes into details of what were the side effects that she had to suffer from that point on, and how her daughter even had a compromised immune system. It just gets very bad. At 35 minutes, the head of the medical division, the head of the medical division of the Manhattan Project, him and some other stooge were sent over to Japan. They were both sent over to Japan to 30 days after the bombings. They sent both of these guys to see what the actual damage was that these bombs had caused towards people. At 37:20, the tracer studies were probably harmless. That's what she says. And the tracers were essentially the thing that were injected into people. The doctor of the Manhattan Project were eager to test out their new babies, right? Essentially discovering these new isotopes, discovering this new thing. A lot of these people were just interested to testing it out, that animal experiments weren't enough, that they had to immediately go into human trial. At 39 minutes, the scale of the test was large and vast. I named all the states already. At 40 minutes, 35 seconds, post-war, it still continued, full body radiation, military funded, and it was said, right, this is the thing that they were lying about. The lie was that it was to study the effects of radiation on cancers and tumors. That was the excuse at the time, the earliest form of excuse. During the 90s, that rhetoric changed to therapeutic radiation therapy. 41 minutes, 50 second-ish. Doctors did not consent. Doctors did not need consent, or did they need to inform you? 42:46. Atomic Energy Commission, quiet investigation. All the staff were spoken to, and when public statements were made, apparently they had no recollection or no memory of these events. They were actively shown memos, documentations, pieces of paper with their signature on it, and all they said was, I don't actually recall any of these events. 43:43. University of California says that it was done to find, the Berkeley and USC basically were using the excuse of, we were just trying to find the cure for bone cancer. At 44 minutes, 10 seconds. The memos from the 70s say otherwise. The idea that it was therapeutic was spun in the 90s. She essentially points out that there were plenty of memos that prove that the negligence that they're claiming isn't real. They fully knew what they were doing. And the Atomic Energy Commission, essentially, they made their first attempt to contact all the original doctors, so that they would destroy paperwork, essentially trying to cover this up. And she even says in this video that she hates to mention that word cover up. It's kind of cliche, but when you actively have all forms of aspects of this study attempting to destroy all this information, I don't know, what would you assume? Now, at 4450, Rochester patients had no clue, and the doctors had no clue what was in the syringe, proving in this case that in some cases, some of these hospitals, some of these clinics, some of these universities had no idea what they were dealing with or what they were handling. 4610, more details on the women's study. That was the pregnant woman study from the Vanderbilt University. Pulled the record since the results were undesirable. Later, the same university tried to protect itself by asking all its participating staff to destroying records. And this is specific to the Vanderbilt University. This was specific to the Tennessee experiments with pregnant women. At 4742, China nuclear secrets. Oh yeah, they were trying to say that these were things of national secrets, and that's why they were withholding these documents, because the doctors feared for the in reality, it was the fact that the doctors were fearing for their careers and their public image, because a lot of them knew that they had participated in egregious shit, and then they were just like, oh no, what would they think of me? 4828, reading a memo, and the author explains it, was far more gruesome, and you had actual people attempting to hide information. That's where you will find that anecdote of or that footnote of her saying that they were actually attempting a cover-up. At 50 minutes 10 seconds, the discussion over classification came about within its ranks, right? She describes that at some point the military and the Department of Energy had to eventually come to a conclusion of, what do we do with classifying all this information? What do we classify it as? And at 5115, she describes and is reading she's reading a memo from her book, right? A memo that she found that was given to her. She's reading verbatim what that memo says. And it essentially says that these people were not informed. They did not have consent. And in the way that it's written, she proves that, look, they're sensitive to consent. They knew what they were doing was completely in the wrong. At 5126, very poor effect on the general public. Can't actually remember that. 5126. See what she says. 26. Actually curious.
They were sensitive to consent. It is unlikely that these tests were made without the consent of the subjects, but no statement is made to that effect in the coldly scientific manner in which the results are tabulated and discussed would have a very poor effect on the general public.
Right? Essentially, if the results were actually known to the people, if the general public knew what had happened to their own brethren, their own citizen, their own neighbors, it would completely, right? It reminds me of that George Bush Sr. quote when he was like, if the American public knew what we were up to, they would hang us from all over the place. 5150, they knew, they knew that the sort of precedent that would take over. Actually, it's just Blair.
Unless, of course, the legal aspects were covered by the necessary documents, the experimenters and the employee agencies, including the U.S., have been laid open to a devastating lawsuit which would, through its attendant publicity, have far-reaching effects.
They were afraid of what precedent would be set if this went to court. Because you want to know why? They knew that they wanted to continue this. They knew that they were going to continue testing on us. So they wanted to make sure that none of this ever went to court, which is why I think the Clinton administration went forward with doing a special investigative body report on this. And why they wanted to get ahead of the story so that the lawyers that were involved in all this set a precedent that left it open-ended to continue human experimentation in this country. At least that's what I believe. Because it's very interesting that in the memo, they're describing the sensitive nature to what this would mean legally. Like, nobody wants to think that far ahead, but I'm just saying. Over the land, they wanted to continue their research well in today's age. Any research. Should we think about what's going on in today's age? Either way. 5233. Doses of the traces, right? And 52 minutes 33 seconds is when she mentions that the Manhattan Project knew what this dosage was that could essentially be detrimental to someone's health. Yet in some cases they would inject it to 5 times the amount. At 56 minutes 41, who were those that were targeted and used? Yeah, very infuriating, and I think I'm just gonna leave it there. I don't want to make this video long. I could play each vocal segment, but she speaks rather slowly. But the videos are in the description below. You can view this for yourself. You can also, I would say, study this yourself. Explain to your family, to your friends, that this never stopped. This kept on continuing. This country has a very long history of eugenicists, a very long history of genetical testing. The people who designed the science institution as we know it today are all involved in this. And we like to believe that we have autonomy over our lives. We don't want to believe that. It's not that we don't. It's, you know what I mean? Like, a lot of people have come to that conclusion that not everything is as it seems. And I don't know. To me, it affects me because of what's going on right now. I have personal family who's currently being affected by what's going on around the world. And not because of the beer flu, but because of what the medical industry told them to do in order to fight off this beer flu. Now I have family who will forever live completely changed and altered because they decided to be participants in an experiment that is across the nation. Hopefully I can educate everyone here a little bit more on American history. And if you want to watch any of my eugenicist videos that I've made already, check my YouTube channel for BitChute, Rumble, because I haven't uploaded those yet to those platforms because that was already a few weeks ago. But I just clearly showing a demonstrable effect that there are certain people who just don't care at all. Oh, sorry, what's that? My earpiece went off. What was the question? I couldn't hear you, right? That's what these people do. That's what these people in office do. I see no evil, I hear no evil, and I speak no evil. Just to obfuscate the fact that somebody had to give Oppenheimer that responsibility. Somebody in government, commission, a committee, somebody had to give him the authority over this. And not only that, they had to give him authority over the military aspect of things, the university aspect of things, the medical hospitals, the clinics, everybody involved in this. How did one person achieve all that authority to just unilaterally, all across America, dictate the lives of thousands? The Clinton administration were the ones who essentially discovered that thousands of people were being tested on. You could still look up in the sky and there's still something going on there. But yet, that all started here with the plutonium files, with them testing radioactive materials over cities, over schools, and over certain selected populations. Either way, my name is Ramirez. Hopefully I taught you something. Watch the videos in the description below. They're very insightful.